of the only inevitabilities in life, and yet you don't always know when the end is nigh. If, perhaps, you have a terminal illness, or if you're aging, you and your loved ones have some time to prepare, both by making memories and by making arrangements before the end. But sometimes death is sudden, and in a human urge to quantify things, we create correlations and connect dots which may not belong together. Sometimes the sign comes from something natural that's been given a supernatural implication. For example, owls and crows have often been connected with the dead, and the regional superstitions differ about what that connection might be. In Appalachia, if you see an owl in daytime, it's an omen of death, and if you see a murder of crows after a funeral, there will be more death on the way. But it's not only animals. If there are 13 people gathered, the first to rise is the first to die. Don't be the middle person in a photo of 3, because you will be the first to die. Black dogs, black butterflies, women in white, white horses, knocks on doors, strange dreams, will-o'-the-wisps, doppelgangers. In some instance or another, there's a story about each of those that foretell the news of someone's death. For example, here's a story from the journal Folklore from 1908, relayed from the sister of someone named A.R., who related to Mabel Peacock, who related to Folklore. Quote, A.R. tells me the following story, which she had tonight from her sister, who lives as general servant with Mr. and Mrs. B. Last Wednesday night, Mr. B was disturbed by a sound like someone knocking at his bedroom window, so he roused his wife and told her that there must be something wrong at his place of business. One of them then struck a light to let anyone who might be outside see that the knocking had awakened them. The noise was not repeated, however. The next morning, a telegram was received which informed them that a brother of Mr. B's had died very suddenly in the street at a town on the English Channel. The death took place a little before or a little after 9 o'clock on Wednesday evening, that is, some hours before the knocking was heard in Lincolnshire. After he received the telegram, Mr. B expressed his conviction that the sound must have been a warning. M, the girl who relayed the story to A.R., knew it was certainly true that he had been aroused in the night, for she had heard him talking with Mrs. B, though she had not caught the sounds which awoke him. Death knocks and similar indications of loss are not uncommon in Lincolnshire folklore. My grandfather, Edward Shaw Peacock, believed that he had been warned of the drowning of a friend by the inexplicable shaking of his bedroom window on a day when the air was quite calm. In the house in which I am writing, such noises are of fairly frequent occurrence, but, so far, they have never coincided with a death. One wardrobe gives out a sharp splitting sound in a most warning-like manner when it is contracting in dry weather, somewhat to the distress of a superstitious acquaintance of mine. I've also heard what was apparently someone knocking at the front door, and on one occasion the door opened just in the manner it does when anyone is coming in. But sometimes there's an omen you can't quite explain away. The knocking, an owl flying into your window during the day, a strange dream of a loved one at the exact time of their death. And sometimes there's a direct and unavoidable warning. There's one story of a gentleman, relayed by someone named Lady Wilde. This gentleman's daughter was strong and healthy, but one night he heard a voice saying, "In 3 weeks death, in 3 weeks the grave, dead, dead, dead." The voice came 3 times. There was no way there was anyone just outside the window trying to mess with this guy, and he checked all over, just to be sure. There was nothing. But the next day, the healthy daughter came down with a fever. 3 weeks later, she was dead. This story is not the only one that Lady Wilde has of death omens, and not even this particular style. There's an entire book released in 1887, she wrote. It's called Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland. And there are a broad number of stories about some sort of a supernatural wail that can foretell the death of the family member. Tonight, on the Dreary Midnight Podcast, we're talking about the Banshee. My name is Lisa. My pronouns are she, they. Let's get into it. Now, what is a Banshee? In Celtic folklore, specifically Irish, it's a being whose keening warns of a family member's death. The name literally means woman of the fairy mound, or something similar. Bean for woman, she for mounds. And because it's Celtic languages, she is spelled S-I-D-H-E. Alternatively, she is part of the term Eos she, spelled A-O-S-S-I, and it's a term for a supernatural race from Celtic mythology who live underground. These are also called the fair folk. Point being, the Banshee is supernatural in some capacity. Stories of the Banshee go back for centuries. Her appearance varies depending on the story and who's telling it and which century and why. Some stories, you don't see her at all and just hear her. Sometimes she takes the form of a female family member who died young, and other times she's seen with a veil, or with a grey cloak, or with wild hair that's either red or blonde. In older times, you saw her more often than you heard her. According to true Irish ghost stories, quote, "The Banshee's method of foretelling death in olden times differed from that adopted by her at the present day." Keep in mind, for true Irish ghost stories, present day is the turn of the 20th century. Now, in the early 20th century, now she wails and wrings her hands, as a general rule, but in the old Irish tales she is to be found washing human heads and limbs, or blood-stained clothes, till the waters all dyed with human blood. This would take place before a battle. If you're going to hear a Banshee, it's most likely going to be at night. And if the Banshee is not showing up as a human, she can appear as a weasel, a stoat, a hare, or a hooded crow. These were all creatures associated with witchcraft in Ireland. There is one reference I saw to an older Banshee called Evil, who haunted near Kincora. According to true Irish ghost stories, Evil appeared to an old king, Brian Boru, before the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 AD. That's the only reference I saw for that particular Banshee, but the legend lives on for the O'Brien clan. We'll get to that in a little bit. One of the earliest first-person records I found was from Anne Lady Fanshawe. Her memoir was not published until 1829, but she wrote it in 1676. The memoir is addressing her only surviving son. She had 5 surviving kids overall, out of 14 pregnancies. And the vibe of the memoir is very much, here's what mom and dad got up to on their numerous travels. And they were traveling a lot. They were English nobility during a time of political unrest. In this memoir, Anne recounts an encounter she had in the winter of 1649. In December of that year, Anne and her husband, Richard, stayed a few nights with Lady Honora O'Brien, and Anne is woken up at 1 a.m. by some strange voice outside the window. I drew the curtain, and in the casement of the window I saw by the light of the moon a woman leaning into the window through the casement in white with red hair and ghastly complexion. She spake aloud, and in a tone I never heard, thrice, Ahona, and then with a sigh more like wind than breath she vanished, and to me her body looked more like a thick cloud than substance. I was so much affrighted that my hair stood on end and my nightclothes fell off. I pulled and pinched your father, who never awaked during this disorder I was in, but at last was much surprised to find me in this fright, and more when I related the story and showed him the window opened. Neither of us slept more that night, but he entertained me with telling how much more these apparitions were usual in that country than in England, because they were staying with Lady Honora in Limerick. The next morning, Lady Honora came to their room and let them know that an O'Brien cousin of hers had died at 2 a.m. According to Lady Honora, and I wish you to have had no disturbance, for it is the custom of this place that when any die of this family, there is the shape of a woman appears in this window every night until they be dead. This woman was many ages ago got with child by the owner of this place, and he in his garden murdered her and flung her into the river under your window. But truly, I thought not of it when I lodged you here, it being the best room that I had. And, well, Anne and Richard left quickly after that. Honestly, I feel like that would be something that you might mention, but Richard knew about the custom, so maybe not. The story from Anne has a few major common elements of the Banshee story. That specific banshees haunt specific families, and that sometimes the banshee can be the trope category of woman in white. In this case, the banshee is haunting the O'Brien family. I looked it up, the O'Briens are a really old family in Ireland, even in the mid-17th century. O'Brien is Honora's maiden name, so it makes sense that the O'Brien Banshee is letting them know about an O'Brien cousin's death. And as mentioned, it's a common trope for a specific banshee to haunt a specific family, but then that raises a few questions. First of all, what would happen if there's a lot of family intermingling? If hypothetically Honora married someone whose family had a different banshee, whose banshee would warn the kids or the grandkids? And what happens with grandkids whose families could be even more intermingled? The answer to this situation seems to be that families differ, intermingling seems to intermingle everything, death omens included, so maybe a banshee might warn about a family member's death, or a death knock, or a dream, or a stoat, or so on. It could vary depending on anything. The other question I had was, what would happen if a family moved abroad, or one branch of a family? But could a banshee let a family know of someone's death if the deceased lived and died overseas? Would the banshee still warn the family living abroad of the death in Ireland? Would the Irish family be warned of the deceased living abroad? The answer, it seems, is yes. The banshee can travel overseas to give her warnings, and I have two accounts for this. First one is from True Irish Ghost Stories, starting here on page 215. A party of visitors were gathered together on the deck of a private yacht on one of the Italian lakes, and during a lull in the conversation, one of them, a colonel, said to the owner, "Count, who's that queer-looking woman you have on board?" The count replied that there was no one except the ladies present and the stewardess, but the speaker protested that he was correct, and suddenly, with a scream of horror, he placed his hands before his eyes and exclaimed, "Oh my God, what a face!" For some time, he was overcome with terror, and at length reluctantly looked up and cried, "Thank heavens, it's gone!" "What was it?" asked the count. "Nothing human," replied the colonel, "nothing belonging to this world. It was a woman of no earthly type, with a queer-shaped gleaming face, a mass of red hair, and eyes that would have been beautiful but for their expression, which was hellish. She had on a green hood, after the fashion of an Irish peasant." An American lady present suggested that the description tallied with that of the banshee, upon which the count said, "I am an O'Neill, at least I am descended from one. My family name is, as you know, Neilsini, which, little more than a century ago, was O'Neill. My great-grandfather served in the Irish Brigade, and on its dissolution at the time of the French Revolution, had the good fortune to escape the general massacre of officers, and in company with an O'Brien and a Maguire, fled across the frontier and settled in Italy. On his death, his son, who had been born in Italy, and was far more Italian than Irish, changed his name to Neilsini, by which name the family has been known ever since. But for all that, we are Irish." "The banshee was yours, then," ejaculated the colonel. "What exactly does it mean?" "It means," the count replied solemnly, "the death of someone very nearly associated with me. Pray heaven it is not my wife or daughter." On that score, however, his anxiety was speedily removed, for within 2 hours he was seized with a violent attack of angina pectoris and died before the morning. Mr. Elliot O'Donnell, True Irish Ghost Stories continues, to whose article on banshees we are indebted for the above, adds, quote, "The banshee never manifests itself to the person whose death it is prognosticating. Other people may see or hear it, but the fated one never, so that when everyone present is aware of it but one, the fate of that one may be regarded as pretty well certain. The other story of traveling Banshee comes from Lady Wilde's book from 1887. A branch of the ancient race of the O'Grady's had settled in Canada, far removed apparently from all of the associations, traditions, and mysterious influences of the old land of their forefathers. But one night a strange and mournful lamentation was heard outside the house. No word was uttered, only a bitter cry, as of one in deepest agony and sorrow, floated through the air. Inquiry was made, but no one had been seen near the house at the time, though several persons distinctly heard the weird, unearthly cry, and a terror fell upon the household, as if some supernatural influence had overshadowed them. Next day, it so happened that the gentleman and his eldest son went out boating. As they did not return, however, at the usual time for dinner, some alarm was excited, and messengers were sent down to the shore to look for them. But no tidings came until, precisely at the exact hour of the night when the spirit cry had been heard the previous evening, a crowd of men were seen approaching the house, bearing with them the dead bodies of the father and the son, who had both been drowned by the accidental upsetting of the boat, within sight of land but not near enough for any help to reach them in time. Now it seems a lot of the Banshee lore has a lot of connection with funeral practices in Ireland, especially before the Christians took everything over. Keening, at least in older Irish tradition, is a style of singing / wailing / loudly mourning or crying in order to mourn the dead at a wake. According to Narelle McCoy, there are different types of laments that could be performed at a wake, all of which were performed to music, including, quote, instrumental laments composed for harp and for pipes. However, only the keening necessitates the actual presence of the deceased, and it is defined as literally crying for the dead, end quote. Music in general, but keening in particular, seems to be a critical part of rituals surrounding death, but there aren't really any records of what it sounded like, even when things like tape recorders and records were more common. According to that same McCoy article, quote, a great deal of anecdotal evidence attests to the superstition surrounding the singing of a keen, out of season, as it is believed to call up death, which certainly explains the reluctance of keeners to consent to participate in such a display. So, nobody would do it exclusively for cultural preservation, and most people have the decency not to show up to a wake with a full recording setup. But the music adds an interesting element to some of the Banshee stories, because sometimes it's not just the vocal music, it's instrumental music as well. When I first started researching this, I'd only heard of the Banshee wailing, not necessarily of any instrumental music. But some accounts do include the instrumentals. Sometimes instead of wailing, sometimes in addition to it. Lady Wilde recounts a story of a noblewoman who is dying and wakes up suddenly and points at a window. Everyone looks to the window, nobody's there. But the servants still heard, quote, the sweetest music, low, soft, and spiritual, floating around the house, and at times apparently close to the window of the sick room. Thinking it a trick of some sort, they go to search the grounds. They didn't find anything human, though the music played on. The woman died the next morning, and that's when the music stopped. And thank you for joining me on this dreary midnight. If you would like to support the show and get additional episodes and a bonus Banshee story, subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/drearymidnight. If you'd like to get in touch, send in an email, drearymidnightpodcast@gmail.com, or follow on Instagram @drearymidnightpod. The music is licensed through Epidemic Sound. A link to Epidemic Sound and the songs used tonight will be in the description box with the sources for tonight's show. Until next time, keep an ear out for impending doom, and safe travels home. on this dreary midnight. Good night.